gostaria de dizer que é um imenso prazer ter a professora Heidi Hurd como nossa convidada no curso de Ética, e eu vou mudar para o inglês imediatamente, em homenagem à nossa convidada. So, it's a great pleasure to have Professor Heidi Hurd not to start, but as an invited professor of our professional ethics invited lecture. And Professor Heidi Hurd is Ross and Helen Wharton Chair in Law, Professor of Philosophy, co-director. She's Professor of the Illinois Program in Law and Philosophy at the University of Illinois College of Law in Champaign. And she's also the author of the very well-known book called The Moral Combat, which has been translated into Portuguese by the Martins Fontes, and also the author of many articles on many areas of law and philosophy, including bankruptcy law, and now more recently she has been very much involved in environmental law, environmental studies. And well, I'll let her to introduce herself, and I'd like to thank her, and also to thank her husband Michael Moore, who has been also invited to be with us. And well, has been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Professor Hurd. She'll talk about the title of her speech: Why Sustain and What We Do Not Value, and Why Value What We Are Not Moved to Sustain.
Thank you, thank you. I guess I should probably, it sounds like this might be helpful. Does that help? Is that even on?
You have to turn it on.
Let's try that one. Ooh, look at that. As my students know, technology and me, we are not like this. We are not like this. I'll try to project though, because I have to stand. I have to move around. I just can't sit. So, and if I get to speaking too quickly, you just put up your hand and say, please, 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 Professor, talk slowly. My own students find my English way too fast. I want to thank Ronaldo for his remarkable hospitality. Coming to Brazil was just a lavish exercise in being spoiled, in indulgences that I don't have the words to express. I only know one word in Portuguese, and that's obrigada. Fortunately, that's apropos, so I say obrigada for everything that we have had the opportunity to experience while here. So, the title of my latest paper in environmental ethics reveals that I'm worried that our unsustainable practices thrive in significant part because we ultimately lack compelling reasons to sustain what we do not value, or to value the things that we're not simply moved to sustain. It's hard to find a natural resource on the planet that isn't already being exploited or isn't already an object of commercial greed. Today, over 65% of vital ecosystem goods and services are being used unsustainably. And that means, by definition, that we are threatening today the ability of those tomorrow to meet basic needs and simple wants. We're depleting groundwater supplies, we're degrading agricultural soils, we're overfishing the oceans, we're cutting down the forests faster than they can regrow, we're leveling mountains for non-renewable energy sources, we're filling in coastal wetland areas in ways that exacerbate the devastating effects of floods and hurricanes, and we're blanketing the globe in greenhouse gases that are affecting global temperatures and threatening catastrophic changes in the Earth's climate patterns. Our conversion of forests and grasslands and wetlands to agriculture and urban development currently threaten the precipitous extinction of 1/3 of the mammal, bird, amphibian, and wild plant species on the globe. And as we consume these earthly resources, we continue to grow in number. Our population having doubled in the past 50 years and projected to be half again as large by the middle of the century. So why are we seemingly so impotent to make changes that will reverse the devastating effects of our own actions on the ecological health of the planet? Why are we so fouling our earthly nest? Well, in this paper, I argue that our unsustainable practices thrive in significant part because we lack a shared understanding of what the goal of sustainability demands of us. And this, I largely argue, is because we do not agree on the moral significance of the natural resources that we're exploiting, the natural habitats that we're converting, and the 10+ million species that we're out competing. So it's possible to extract from the literature on sustainability 4 positions concerning what we must sustain and why. And the first 2 of these 4 positions are thought to be variants of so-called weak sustainability, while the second 2 entail considerably more onerous obligations of conservation. So let me just walk you through these 4 distinct accounts. So on what has been termed a very weak theory of sustainability, both individuals, you and me, and organizations have obligations to protect total capital. That is, capital that's comprised both of raw earthly resources, what many now call natural capital, and what I'm going to call artificial capital, a term that captures Marx's category of instruments of labor, namely products generated from raw resources by the investment of human ingenuity and human labor. So in this theory, raw resources can be consumed so long as aggregate social welfare is preserved or ideally enhanced. So when the loss of natural capital can be offset by the substitution of artificial resources, there can be no objection to the complete exhaustion and elimination of those raw resources. So if the substitution of crab with a K, fake crab, right? If the substitution of crab with a K, which is made of plentiful Pacific whiting, for crab with a C, the real thing, doesn't come at a net cost to human welfare, well, there can be no objection to the continued depletion and the ultimate extinction of snow and Russian king crabs. And if the substitution of plastic trees for real trees will not come at any diminishment of human welfare, because, for example, fake trees could be engineered to perform all the functions valuable to humans, then this concept of sustainability, the weakest version of sustainability, will deem the substitution of plastic trees for real trees to be sustainable, and cattle ranchers and loggers can mow down the Brazilian forests. So as Robert Solow writes, the duty imposed by sustainability is to bequeath to posterity not any particular thing, but rather to endow them with whatever it takes to achieve a standard of living at least as good as our own. And you know, successive generations can be expected to have adapted preferences. Namely, so long as their needs are met, they can't be expected to miss what they've never known. How many people lose sleep because it's no longer possible to see a dinosaur, writes Wilfred Beckerman. So while our present consumption may drive tigers and rhinos and blue whales and black panthers to extinction, they may prove to be weakly sustainable if future generations no more miss these creatures than we miss dinosaurs. Now, the second account of sustainability that is commonly labeled weak sustainability varies from its even weaker sibling, only because those who propound it are willing to empirically stipulate that at this point in human history there are numerous functions performed by natural systems that can't be replicated effectively by artificial technologies. So, for example, human survival is now presently hostage to the Earth's biogeochemical cycles. And these thus count, in David Pearce's terms, as critical habitat or critical natural capital that can't be traded for artificial capital without a loss in human welfare. Now, in this theory, nature's raw resources and its complex systems are solely instrumental in value. And so long as there's no prospect, though, of crafting artificial substitutes of equivalent value to, say, the watershed protection functions of tropical rainforests, their lexical value over non-critical natural goods demand that they be sustained. Now, the third theory of sustainability, which has earned the term strong sustainability, calls for the preservation of irreversible natural capital. On this theory, there may be many irreversible losses of natural capital that don't impact on humans at all, and thus can't count as losses of critical capital. So this theory implies that strong sustainability marks the transition to accounts that seek to sustain more than that which sustains us. To those who despair the losses of species that made no dent in human welfare, and to those who assign value to works of nature for which there are functionally equivalent substitutes, this theory gives expression to their implicit, pluralistic convictions that things other than human welfare can be of intrinsic value. So on this approach, while losses of natural capital can be compensated for by gains in artificial capital, those substitutes can't come at the cost of anything in nature that cannot be replenished, right? Even when those irreversible losses would not mark a diminishment in human welfare. So no amount of yellowfin tuna can substitute for the extinction of bluefin tuna. No amount of reforestation in Indonesia can substitute for the extinction of indigenous plant species here in Brazil. So artificial substitutions for natural goods and services are legitimate on this third account, so long as they represent adequate substitution for all entities that the value of which depend on these goods and services. So natural corridors can be bulldozed if it doesn't wipe out any endemic species, all right? And if artificial landscaping, can restore places for restful stopovers for migratory species. And tree cover can be eliminated along the thoroughfares of Costa Rica as long as, ropes are strung across those thoroughfares that allow endangered monkeys to swing across fast-moving lanes of traffic. And wetlands can be filled so long as offsets are purchased elsewhere that prevent the irreversible loss of non-human species. Now, the fourth and the strongest theory of sustainability, denigrated by some as absurdly strong, rejects the description of nature as capital, rejects it altogether, and rejects the notion that the only check on welfare-enhancing trades that substitute artificial goods for natural goods is the injunction not to cause irreversible losses. So on this view, the value of things that have been produced through billions of years of evolution isn't given by the degree to which these things instrumentally advance human welfare. We are, on this view, not entitled to elevate gains to human welfare above the satisfaction of the needs of the 10 million plus other species with whom we share the planet. And this is true even if our consumption will not cause irreversible losses to the library of evolution. Instead, we have to share the Earth's limited resources and sustain its life-supporting ecological systems in ways that answer to a theory of distributive justice that takes non-human entities to be independently deserving recipients. Okay, so who gets the better of this four-way debate? Can proponents of weak sustainability defend their exclusive concern for human welfare when humans are but one of 10 million plus species on this globe? Inversely, can proponents of strong sustainability do better at defending their claim that non-human entities possess intrinsic value of a sort that places moral limits on the ability of humans to satisfy their needs and ever-increasing wants? Can they equip non-human entities with moral weapons that have the ability to stop humans in their moral tracks, right? That have the power to make acts that would be welfare-enhancing, nevertheless wrongful? That's the question, right? Well, as I argue in part 2 of my paper, weak sustainability has found its most ardent champions amongst economists, precisely because weak sustainability appears to be concomitant with the commitments of modern welfare economics. Indeed, it's tempting to think that accounts that are properly located at the weak end of the spectrum can't claim to be theories of environmental sustainability at all. Because if human welfare is the sole and only thing of value, then the degree to which natural capital should be valued is purely a contingent function of the degree to which welfare can be, sustained and advanced without it. So the environment enjoys no place of special privilege in a theory that's dedicated to maximizing welfare. Its value is instrumental, and if humans are good at anything, they're good at inventing instruments that progressively supplant the need for nature's more primitive creations. Still, welfare economics draws its moral breath from utilitarianism, which holds that morality requires the maximization of one and only one thing, namely welfare. That's the one and only intrinsic good, construed by Bentham as pleasure, by Mill as happiness, and by modern welfare economists as preference satisfaction. But as Bentham insisted, there are many species on the planet that are sentient, right? That experience pleasure and pain, and that thus can be thought to have preferences. So the question is whether proponents of weak sustainability can defend their exclusive concern for human welfare when welfare is the property of all sentient beings. It would seem that just as utilitarianism or utilitarian defenses of slavery were made preposterous by the exclusion of the preferences of slaves, so one should think that weak sustainability is made equally preposterous by giving only one of thousands of sentient species exclusive domain over the resources of the planet upon which the welfare of all sentient beings depends. Now, this line of criticism suggests that utilitarianism and the versions of weak sustainability that owe their allegiance to its moral precepts might be made more plausible if they enlarge the domain of those for whom welfare was a property. Could we expand the utilitarian calculus so that non-human welfare counted in computations of what must be sustained? So if welfare were translated classically as pleasure and pain, this would expand the domain to at least include animals that are sentient, and the same is true if welfare is taken to concern itself with preference satisfaction, because animals are plausibly thought to have at least simple desires. And of course, if the domain of those whose welfare counts is extended to include members of future generations of humans and animals, then our welfare calculations might well dictate actions that protect and preserve species and ecosystems and biospheres which themselves may have no capacities for pleasure. We might then arrive at an expanded version of weak sustainability that gives lexible priority to sustaining critical natural capital that's critical not only to sustaining human welfare, but also to sustaining the welfare of all non-human entities that themselves possess welfare. But you know, any brand of utilitarianism that correlates moral action with subjective satisfaction can't vest intrinsic value in entities that don't have subjective experiences. And as such, their fate is properly at the whim of those of us who can have preferences about them. So weak sustainability, even if it were expanded to include the utiles of sentient animals, would continue to value most life forms and most natural resources and systems and services and features, not for themselves, but only because, and only so long as, they're of instrumental value. So forests and flowers and mountains and valleys and grasslands and jungles and tundra and taiga, all of these would be sustained only if they provide value that can't otherwise be provided artificially. Now, perhaps if the category of those whose welfare counts is expanded beyond humans, we'd find that these remarkable evolutionary feats of nature do not have, and perhaps will never have, artificial substitutes. But to those who continue to believe that the old growth trees of the Amazon and the vast Grand Canyon are themselves of independent moral value, then weak sustainability will continue to be a poor match to their intuitions. Now, defenders of stronger theories of sustainability are certainly going to applaud the adoption of a non-anthropocentric theory of welfare, but they're still going to argue that many other things that are not sentient and that therefore don't have welfare at all should also be sustained for their own sake. And so, in part 3 of my paper, I ask whether there's a moral alternative to utilitarianism upon which they might base their non-welfarist accounts of strong sustainability. And you know, the most celebrated rollout of an agenda to implement a strong theory of sustainability predicated on claims of right rather than on claims of instrumental value was Bolivia's 2012 announcement of legislation granting all nature rights equal to those possessed by humans. So the law of Mother Earth purported to establish 11 new rights for nature, including the right to life and to continue vital cycles free from human alteration, the right to pure water and clean air, the right not to have cellular structure genetically altered, the right not to be affected by mega infrastructure, and so forth. Now, one can appreciate that rights rhetoric can have powerful instrumental advantages. And Bolivia is struggling to cope with rising temperatures and more extreme weather events that are, threatening frequent floods and droughts and frosts and mudslides. And of course, most troublingly, as the planet warms, Bolivia's vast glaciers are melting. And Bolivian glaciologists anticipate that Bolivia may, be little more than a vast desert within a century. But while it may be rhetorically useful to claim that Mother Earth has rights, the question is, does she? Does she? Can proponents of a strong theory of sustainability invoke rights on behalf of natural entities to bolster their claim, their insistence that we aren't entitled to trade off the existence of species and the preservation of old-growth forests, for example, for gains in welfare? So there are two types of rights theories, and it has to be admitted that neither make obvious room for the rights of non-human entities. On versions of the will theory, rights are instruments of autonomy. They allow one to assert dominion over others' actions. So to have a right is by definition to be able to waive it, manipulate it, dictate the terms of its satisfaction. So on the will theory of rights, there can be no non-waivable rights, and there can be no rights holders who are not able to waive rights. And so that means that fetuses and infants and the senile and the insane and the comatose are without rights. And it follows a fortiori that animals and plants and species and ecosystems and biomes can't be afforded rights except metaphorically. So on the will theory of rights, Bolivia's talk about Mother Nature having rights is just that. Namely, it's just talk. Now on the second theory of rights, the interest theory, rights reflect powerful interests. So a right on this view is what one has when one's interests in a matter become substantial enough that one's life will go appreciably better if those interests are served in an obligatory way. So as Joseph Raz puts it, a person may be said to have a right if and only if some aspect of his well-being, some interest of his, is sufficiently important in itself to justify holding some other person to be under a duty. Okay, so on this theory, only beings capable of having interests are capable of having rights, but something can have interests without being an autonomous agent capable of exercising choice. The question for strong sustainability proponents is whether non-humans can have interests. Now again, it seems philosophically feasible to argue that animals have interests, because creatures that are sentient are capable again of feeling pain and pleasure. And as such, they're capable of living lives that are subjectively better or worse for them. What's more philosophically challenging is to make out a claim that non-sentient entities might have interests that would support strong sustainability proponents in arguing either for the Bolivian-style recognition of rights in the biosphere itself, or for the recognition of rights possessed by individual non-sentient entities, like particular trees, particular plants, and fungi, or groupings of entities, like species, or ecosystems, or biomes. Now, some have argued that while things can't matter to individual plants or to collectivities, such as coral reefs, they can matter for them. So, as one theorist has put it, matters can be better or worse for the tree, and this amounts to saying that the tree on its own has its goods and its harms. Or in von Wright's view, any being that can meaningfully be said to be well or ill, to thrive or to flourish, is a being of whose good it is meaningful to talk. And James Michelani derives the interests of all living things essentially from their possession of self-ameliorative competence, namely the capacity of a living being to adjust to its circumstances in a manner that enhances its survival and natural growth. But these claims, as useful as they may be to those interested in bolstering a strong theory of sustainability, have to answer several criticisms. And I go through a number of them in the paper. Consider just one of those that I explore in the paper. There may be many things that are good for an entity, but this doesn't mean that it is itself good, or that it possesses a good, right? So while there are conditions that enable a virus to do well, to thrive or to flourish, this doesn't mean by itself that the virus has interests that are of such a sort that properly command the moral attention or concern of humans, right? So put differently, that things can be instrumentally good for an entity is not sufficient to infuse that entity with goodness and to thereby make its goods into interests that might accumulate to the point of that thing having rights. We can't confuse what Holmes Ralston describes as an entity that is value-able, namely able to use things in the service of its own good, with the notion of what is valuable. But perhaps we can assess the wisdom of dwelling on problems like this and some of the other problems I raise in the paper. Perhaps we can assess whether it would be fruitful to wrestle with these problems by asking into the implications of recognizing non-human entities as having rights, as being rights holders. What would be the normative implications of concluding that individual living things or collectivities of things have rights? I mean, would the fishing industry around the globe be stopped from bottom trawling or dynamite fishing? Would Americans be barred from peeling back Appalachian mountains in order to extract their seams of coal? Would Brazilians be prevented from bulldozing tracts of the Amazon for grazing lands and croplands? It might seem at first blush that the virility of rights turns on whether they create categorical obligations, as deontologists argue, or whether they can instead be sacrificed in order to protect more weighty rights, as rights consequentialists maintain. Because for rights consequentialists, rights are normatively significant because they define the borders of legitimate utilitarian justifications. So rights bar the ability of others to use the object of a right, one's life, one's property, one's liberty, for example, as a resource for the advancement of others' welfare. So rights trump utility judgments for rights consequentialists, but they can be traded for the protection of other rights that are more numerous or more weighty. Now, for deontologists, in contrast, not only can rights not be traded for increases in social welfare, they can't be traded to protect an even greater number of other equal or more weighty rights. So if I have a right not to be tortured, and it's of a deontological sort, then others have a duty not to torture me, even if by torturing me they could prevent a number of others from being tortured or even killed. Now, those who find it philosophically incredible to imagine attributing rights to animals or to other non-human entities will no doubt be relieved to recognize that rights consequentialism at least permits the sacrifice of some rights for other more weighty, probably human rights. Because nobody believes that plants can't be harvested for food, or that trees can't be cut for necessary shelter or warmth, or that species of harmful viruses and bacteria and pests can't be altogether eradicated. But you know, rights consequentialism allows humans to continue to insist that their rights are the weightiest, and that their rights justify the exploitation of non-humans and other natural resources, even if those resources are themselves assigned rights. And so it may be that, you know, rights consequentialism simply doesn't have the muscle to rein in the continued sacrifice of the environment for human purposes. So strong sustainability theorists who remain hopeful that rights can vindicate their view that human ends have to sometimes, and perhaps often, give way to the protection of the environment, they're going to be, you know, tempted to insist that the rights of nature are of a deontological pedigree, right? That they create categorical duties on the part of humans that can't be violated, even in the name of other rights, let alone increased welfare. But you know, it would be wrong to suppose that deontology doesn't permit a fair bit of wiggle room for those who are anxious to maximize good consequences at the expense of nature's bounty. Indeed, as I argue in the paper, the faith that many have in the moral muscle of rights ultimately proves naive, because rights have a multitude of scope restrictions that effectively provide loopholes for those who are anxious to maximize human welfare at the expense of nature's bounty. So let me just give you a couple of examples that I go through. I go through a fair menu in the paper, but let me just give you a couple of the examples that I work with. So first, many rights theorists embrace the doctrine of double effect, a classic precept within Catholic ideology, that holds that while rights can't be violated purposefully, good consequences can justify rights violations that are merely known side effects. So, to take the classic example, a bombardier, can drop a bomb on the enemy's munitions plant in order to bring the war to a speedy end by destroying a vast stockpile of the enemy's munitions, despite knowing that that bomb will effectively kill 100 civilians who live around the munitions plant. But they can't drop a bomb on that housing development of 100 civilians purposefully in order to bring about the war, even if so doing would bring about the war as speedily as if that bomb were dropped on the munitions plant. Now, if embraced, the doctrine of double effect would likely license a good deal of environmental damage, because think about it. Environmental damage is rarely purposive. We don't set out to damage the environment. It's typically much more a known side consequence of human activities that are otherwise devoted to advantageous ends. Second, some maintain, and I think all of us live up to this, that one can often permissibly risk what one can't knowingly cause. In fact, we do this every day, right? I can risk another's death by driving them to work. I can risk my children's deaths by raising them near a lake. I can risk a friend's death by taking him tandem skydiving. Even though I couldn't do any of those things, if I knew that by doing those things, I would bring about those deaths. And even this claim actually requires modification, because we regularly take people to be justified in pursuing activities like building skyscrapers and blasting tunnels and mining for gold that they know, as a statistical matter, will cause others' deaths when they don't know the specific identity of those who will be killed, i.e., when as to the specific people who die, they are mere riskers, right? Now, if rights don't protect against being risked, then many activities that adversely impact the environment will remain permissible. And this is particularly so if rights are possessed by individuals rather than groups, because it has to be a frequent phenomenon for people to know statistically that they're going to cause harm to classes of animals or plants through water pollution, air pollution, toxic waste dumping, without knowing or being able to know which individual animals or plants will be harmed. And all this is to say that the precautionary principle, which holds that in instances of doubt, people have to err on the side of caution, may not follow from according environmental entities' rights, because caution, namely the avoidance of risks, is not itself morally obligatory. So after working through an array of these sorts of scope restrictions, I'm forced to conclude at the end of part 3 that strong sustainability proponents are likely to be disappointed by the enduring moral license that humans will have to exploit nature, even if nature is recognized as having rights, and even if those rights are of a deontological sort. So I close the paper in part 4 by asking whether we might instead extract a theory of strong sustainability from an altogether alternative tradition in moral philosophy, namely from the school of thought that takes morality to reside less in our actions and more in our character. So perhaps a virtuous person is a person who's motivated to act as if a theory of strong sustainability required what we couldn't get it to require. Perhaps virtue demands that we treat the environment as if it had the moral muscle to prevent us from exploiting the loopholes that rights make available through their scope restrictions. Now, this third account draws on the view that morality consists of two sorts of duties: deontic duties and eretaic duties. Deontic duties, whatever your theory of their content, whether it's rights-based or utilitarian-based, deontic duties concern actions at razor points in time that are prohibited or required. Eretaic duties, this is a good word for cocktail parties, right? You know about eretaic duties, concern dispositions, attributes of character that have to be cultivated or suppressed over a lifetime to be thought a person of good character. So the objects of deontic duties are commissions or omissions at razor points in time. Eretaic duties are enduring dispositions, cumulatively possessed, cumulatively defining the kind of person a person is. So a man does his deontic duty if he sustains his children, in a material state that meets their essential physical and psychological needs. But we don't think that a father does his eretaic duty unless he loves his children, unless he possesses that complex package of dispositional attitudes toward them that include affection and empathy and identification and concern and pride. Right? Now, inasmuch as virtuous character traits are psychological dispositions, they'll often bleed over into circumstances in which they're not on moral grounds absolutely required. Character traits are habits of thought and action. They incline one towards beliefs and judgments and decisions before reason even has its full say. They function as default responses, right? As first instincts. And they often define our essential selves precisely because they show themselves in moments of crisis or excitement, right? When the powers to think and strategize are in limbo. Now, one might plausibly think then that to be a virtuous person, one has to possess a set of character traits that collectively motivates one to act as a theory of strong sustainability would require. So virtue would demand that one treat the environment as if it possessed intrinsic value, as if it possessed the independent moral considerability that one might to be able to defend if one's moral schools of thought were less devotedly anthropocentric. So what are those personal traits of character from which we might extract a strong theory of sustainability? Well, put most broadly, it seems to me that to be virtuous is to know one's place in the universe. It's to recognize that we're newcomers to a place long occupied by others. As they say, if you take the history of life as the length of your arm, one stroke of a nail file eliminates human history. On pain of violating the first come, first serve, and finders keepers maxims that even a child learns, you might think that to be a virtuous person, one should be dispositionally reluctant to displace anything that's already come to rely for its existence on its present circumstances. And second, to know one's place in the universe, you might think it's to exhibit environmental humility. It's to appreciate how short our lives are in comparison to other living things. The The longest living plant on Earth right now is 5,000 years old, right? One who would cut down a 2,000-year-old sequoia tree in an hour for pulp, or who would employ outdated fishing gear that traps and kills an enormous bycatch, or who would level a mountain in days that took millennia to form, or who would drive a species to extinction in order to build a shopping center, lacks the sort of perspective that one might think constitutive of a virtuous person. And third, a virtuous person, you might think, is a generous person. Someone who bestows benefits on others even when they can't be said to be entitled or deserving. Inasmuch as generosity crosses the boundaries of desert, it wouldn't be crazy to think that it would cross the boundaries between humans and animals, between animals and plants, between species and ecosystems and biospheres. One would expect that the virtuous person would take all things that could be made better to be worthy objects of generosity, and thus to make sacrifices for the good of environmental entities in the same way that the generous person makes sacrifices for other people. And finally, to be virtuous, it seems to be is not just to be morally modest, it's to be epistemically modest. It's to resist the arrogance of conquerors who destroy what's local before they even know its value. So that in the absence of full